what is the appropriate application of James 5:16? Let's take a look, make sure I quote this again right. It's one of these familiar verses. James 5:16 says, "Confess your faults to one another and pray for one another, that ye may be healed. The effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much." So what's the appropriate application of James 5:16 is Jeffrey's question. And he wrote earlier this morning, -3 degrees in Noblesville, Indiana, and hope it's a little bit warmer for you now, but chill across the country pretty much today. And Jeffrey goes on, adds some insight to the question. He says, what is meant by effectual or fervent or availeth? How do we know our prayers are effectual, fervent, and availing? This is actually a very good question as it relates to biblical interpretation. So you take this, rather fantastic promise in James 5:16, confess your faults to one another, pray for one another that ye may be healed. And then in light of that healing, he says, the effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. So that being true, you would want to say, what is an effectual prayer? What is a fervent prayer? Is it a prayer where you sweat? Is it a prayer that took more than 2 hours or more than 30 minutes? Or, what makes fervent? Is it one you prayed out loud? Is it one that you cried during? What is a fervent prayer? And a righteous man, what is it that is required for the righteousness here? And that one's the easiest part, is what is righteousness, but then it says, availeth much. Well, availeth much to what? What is it that it provides? This is one of those passages that just opens up a world of questions. And so, because of that, first of all, I would be a little leery of any preacher who's got some pretty pat answers on here, just, smug, simple, simplistic answers that answer these, because this doesn't really totally answer the question about fervent prayer, effectual prayer, and what is it that these avail. Now, let me just give a few insights into, hopefully that will help here. First of all, Paul is the apostle to the church, and he's the one that we ought to get our instruction from for daily Christian living. And of course, prayer would be one of the things of daily Christian living. And Paul does command us to pray many times. Pray for me, pray for the king, others. He gives the command for Christians in the age of grace to pray. So we're supposed to pray. We know that. But interestingly, as you go through the words of Paul, he doesn't give any instruction to pray, and he really doesn't even give any promises to prayer. The closest thing you can do is, again, I may have to paraphrase this just a little bit, but in everything by prayer and supplication, let your requests be made known unto God, and the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will be given unto you. So this is the closest that Paul comes to a promise of prayer, is you by laying it down at his feet, you will have the peace of God. Now, I happen to think that in this age of grace, what we know is we're supposed to pray, and the thing that we can most get out of prayer is the peace of knowing that we have prayed, that we have left that down at the feet of Jesus through our prayers. And I think the other promises of prayer that are fantastic in the Gospels, for example, these promises are given in a very specific age, time, setting, which we do not live. And often these promises of prayer are claimed, and yet I don't think they really belong to us. So then the question, comes with James to say, is James 5:16 one that we can claim like this and know that if our prayer is effectual, whatever that means, and it's fervent, whatever that means, then it's going to avail much, whatever that means. And we would have to put some issues. Now, I think that James writes very early on. In fact, likely James is writing even before the Council of Jerusalem. James is writing in a time in which he may not have even been aware of what God was doing through Paul among the Gentiles. James is very clear at the beginning that he is writing to those who are scattered. Maybe even at the time that James writes that Saul of Tarsus is carrying out the persecution, and Jews who are messianic, that is, believing Jews, they are fleeing from Paul, who at this point is not even saved. Now, well, I don't know that for sure, but maybe this is those scattered tribes that James is speaking to. And so James, I think, should be read as a Jewish epistle. Strangely, even those who don't read it as a Jewish epistle call it a Jewish epistle or a Hebrew epistle. And that is, it is a message for those who are of the Jewish faith. They're meeting in the synagogue. They're meeting in the temple. In fact, you read James and it gives that example of the man with all the rings and the robes. And he doesn't say when he comes into the church. He says when he comes into your synagogue. And so here's people who, again, they're having, they're walking within the confines of Judaism. Just like Peter was when he was at the home of Simon the tanner. He says, I'm not going to eat that unkosher stuff. I don't do that. That's not who I am. I've never done that, because the Lord hadn't released them from that at this point. I think James is right there in that particular place in the working of God. So he's writing to believing Jews who are active in their Judaism. They believe that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. And so it's a message that is of the kingdom age, the age in which the kingdom was being offered to the nation of Israel. And I think that there are prayer promises and even promises of spiritual gift that have to do with the kingdom age, that once that kingdom age was removed, put in abeyance, put in a hold for the future, is not applicable for today. So I don't think that we do ourselves any favor when we apply James directly to the church. In fact, I think that's one of the reasons we find so many conflicts with James and with the Apostle Paul, because we're trying to put them speaking to the church in the age of grace. And we do that just because we've been very sloppy at rightly dividing the word of truth. And we're not carrying that out correctly. So I just think that you need to be careful when you create a works-based prayer life. And that's what this is. Effectual, fervent, righteous, then it's going to avail much. So I don't know how you are going to define effectual, fervent, and righteous without making it works-based somehow. So then we build a prayer theology that says, if you live this way and do these things, then your prayers are going to be answered. And I don't think Paul gives any of those kind of assurances there. Other than, pray and the peace of God that passes all understanding will be yours. I might just add, and of course we could go for weeks on that particular issue. Particular issue, but two sources I would recommend for that particular question. One is my own study called Praying in the Age of Grace. You can find it on YouTube, Randy White YouTube. It's youtube.com/Randy White. And look for Praying in the Age of Grace. It's a 4 or 5 session series that I hope to turn into a book someday, but I haven't done it yet. And then another resource is one by Sir Robert Anderson called The Silence of God. It is one that is not directly related to this particular verse here, but it is about this age and where is God today, and how come those people who seem to have the most effectual, fervent prayers, and they're the most righteous people, their prayers don't seem to be availing much. And it just honestly digs into that question. I know some people don't want to be honest about digging into that question. They just want to gloss over it a little bit and say, well, God answers with a yes or a no or a maybe. But think about that. God answers with a yes, no, or a maybe. That is not the promises. If 2 or 3 of you are gathered together, whatever you ask in my name, it'll be given to you. Coming up with this God answers in yes, no, or maybe is just a cop-out. I think we have to really, honestly, hard-hitting kind of deal with these kind of questions here today. And so that's the 2 resources I would recommend. But I just wanted to say that I think that really here, going back to the question, what's the appropriate application of James 5:16? I think the appropriate application is to apply it to the Jewish people living in James's day prior to the age of grace. I think to directly apply it into the age of grace today, you're going to build a works-based prayer life, and you're going to build some things that I think are going to lead to a disappointment there. So thank you for that question, Jeffrey in cold Noblesville, Indiana this morning.